Well, good afternoon. I'm Ryan Kolker, Presidential Advisor at the National Institute of Building Sciences. The Institute's President, Henry Green, sends his regrets that he can't be here today, but I think we've had a very robust discussion, and the Institute has certainly been pleased and happy to participate in this activity. I think it's only fitting that, based off of the conversation we've had today around building codes, that we end the day talking with the folks that actually develop those codes and standards, that engage with the mayors that we just heard from about adopting and implementing and enforcing those codes and standards. We have a great panel of representatives from the codes and standards development organizations. We'll hear from Dominic Sims, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the International Code Council. He has 30 years of experience in the area of building safety and resilience at many levels of government and in the private sector. Kathleen Almond is Vice President of Research at the National Fire Protection Association, where she is responsible for its affiliated research foundation and its fire analysis, research, data analytics, and library functions. Jim Rosberg is the Managing Director of Engineering Programs of the American Society of Civil Engineers. He's been with ASCE for over 22 years, and prior to his current position, he was Director of the Structural Engineering Institute, where he has served as Secretary of the ASCE 7 Standards Committee on Minimum Design Loads for Buildings and Other Structures. And then finally, we'll hear from Mick Schwedler, who serves on the Board of Directors and was Chair of SSPC 90.1, which is responsible for the development of ASHRAE Standard 90.1 for energy efficiency in buildings. In his day job, Mick is involved in the development and support of HVAC systems for Trane since 1982. Before I turn it over to the panelists, let me provide a quick introduction to the Institute, why we are particularly interested in today's event. The Institute was established by the US Congress in 1974 to work across the public and private sector to improve the built environment. Codes, standards, and other technical criteria have been at the center of our work from the very beginning. We've also been a longtime champion of resilience and disaster mitigation through our Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council and Building Seismic Safety Council. As many of you know, the Institute's Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council developed the study on the benefit of FEMA investment in mitigation. The $1 spent results in $4 of future benefit. The Institute is now in the process of developing the next version of the study to look at all federal investment and the benefits of private sector mitigation. Building codes will certainly be a key component of that study. We also recently released a framework with multiple incentive pathways to capture both public and private mechanisms for mitigation. So I'll turn over the discussion to our panelists to provide some brief opening remarks about their work.
Thank you, Ryan. And I want to thank Alice Hill and Josh Barnes and the administration for their tireless work, not just in this week's event, but others over the past month. They've really helped raise awareness. I also want to thank the administration for the Building Safety Month proclamation. Again, another opportunity for us all to raise our profile and make the public more aware about the importance of building safety. Judge Hill's staff suggested that we try to lead the event off or our comments with something personal. So I heeded that advice, and I asked my 24-year-old daughter, Jamie, who just recently got married and is building a new house, who probably doesn't know a lot about building codes. I asked her about resiliency. What does resiliency mean to you? And she left me a little sticky note this morning, and it says, Dad, when you get knocked down, you come back even stronger. So don't underestimate the millennials' ability to grasp what resiliency is all about. They just put it in, I guess, 140 characters or so. Let me just talk a little bit about the International Code Council and the collaboration we have with so many organizations to help make communities safer and buildings stronger. I want to talk a little bit, I guess in the spirit of Building Safety Month, a little bit about what we have to celebrate, because I think you always need to understand what you've been doing right and do more of it. Over the past 100 years, the codes and standards community have done a lot of things right. We have improved structural requirements to resist hazardous loads, winds, floods, seismic. We've developed fire suppression systems and hazard warning systems that are quite effective, as we heard in earlier comments. We've standardized egress and fall prevention requirements that have minimized injuries due to fires and falls. We have implemented ground fault circuit interrupters, which have saved countless lives and prevented needless electrocutions. We have mainstreamed accessibility requirements, so no longer do you have to go somewhere else to figure out how to design a building to accommodate those with special needs. Accessibility requirements have been mainstreamed into the code. We've learned to control human waste to prevent the outbreak of diseases. We've improved indoor air quality. And over the last several years, we have worked collaboratively to help improve energy efficiency and water conservation. And now our homes today are 30% on average more efficient than they were just 6 years ago. So there's a lot, I think, to be celebrated and a lot of people to thank for working, again, collaboratively. That's the good news. But we have a long way to go. And as Robert Ivy mentioned earlier, we have the American Institute of Architects and the National Institute of Building Sciences to thank for bringing together a coalition of more than 20 organizations that represent over 750,000 industry professionals that are leading an effort to also raise awareness of the importance of building more resiliently. And ICC is a part of that organization, is trying very hard to make sure that our members are acutely aware of what it means to be more resilient. One interesting fact that I noted, a recent study by the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies that just looked at wind events since 1988 found that FEMA paid out about $125 billion in grant funds on insured losses. But if those same losses were built just to today's standards, the International Residential Code, disaster aid could have been reduced by nearly 20% or $13 billion. So there are countless stories like that, countless studies like that. But collectively adding those various data points together are clearly a case for why it's so important for us to look at resiliency and sustainability. Our future challenges, I think, though, have to do with changing some of the mindset. And as we've looked at, as we've focused on some of the other areas of opportunity in the past, we've looked very closely at the health and safety requirements in our codes today. But now it's time to turn our attention to the general welfare of our communities, because it's not just enough to prevent something from happening. We need to be able to assure that buildings are built stronger and are able to be utilized and occupied after major events. To that, ICC is looking at 4 major areas that we're committing to redouble our effort. One is to refine and modernize resiliency and assure that the international codes reflect the most current science and are in compliance with the principles defined in OMB Circular A119. We're committing to bolstering our commitment to resiliency and education related to NIST's Resilient Communities Team Plan. The big news for us at ICC today is that we're pledging $100,000 in order to update the study that Ryan Kolker mentioned, which is an important study from an elected official's perspective. One of the things that we have done on countless occasions is talk to local elected officials about resiliency and about why it's important to assure that you're utilizing the most current and contemporary codes and standards. And the study that NIBS conducted and the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council provided nearly 11 years ago now is so important because it very easily and simply communicates why it's important to build better and stronger. Because for every dollar that you invest, you save $4. And that study, we understand, is in the process of being updated, and we're pledging our commitment to help get it there. And then finally, we're working with the Community and Regional Resiliency Institute and the U.S. Resiliency Council to help find a better way to communicate the overall message about resiliency to communities and give community leaders and policymakers tools in which to benchmark and measure themselves and to communicate to their constituencies why it's important to take the kinds of steps that the mayors just talked about and be able to convince the stakeholders and the voters in your community of the benefits to building better and stronger. So with that, I'd like to again thank the administration for the opportunity today, and thank my colleagues up here for the conversation.
Thanks, Ryan. How are we doing? All right. Is that all right? Good. I was struck actually by Alice's remarks measuring the impact of building codes on fire loss in homes. And reflecting on this picture behind me, which is a picture of a wildfire, and as we reflect on what's going on in Fort McMurray, Alberta at the moment, I'm a Canadian and have a college colleague who works for one of the mining companies in Fort McMurray, and I was talking to him by the email this morning, and how you doing? He said, well, you know, it'll be more than a month at a minimum till we're back. And it really struck me contrasting your remarks and what building codes have done for structural fire safety and what we really need to do and need to think about doing as it relates to wildland fire, which of course is, climate change and its impact and the increase in wildland fire. So the difference between wildland fire and structure fire is, as other speakers have already said, we are the magnitude of these events is changing. We can't use past experience to really help us understand what kind of design challenges we're going to have for wildland fire. So this slide is, I think, particularly appropriate at the moment. And for NFPA, as we consider in our organization and the codes and standards that we develop, how we can learn from the successful experience we had with structure fires for the wildland fire problem. So one of the points I wanted to mention really as we talk about codes in general is that as we deal with these issues, we really need to think about sort of this broad ecosystem of codes and standards. I mean, we have our building codes, our physical infrastructure codes, but there are the standards for the protection systems that go into those buildings. There are standards that NFPA writes for emergency response, for emergency management, for business continuity, standards to protect our emergency response community as they respond to these events. So there's a sort of a large range of codes and standards that all need to begin to think about addressing in some respects, these unknown challenges that are going to result here from climate change. So just wanted to kind of put that in perspective because we are thinking about that at NFPA. And actually, a lot of our thinking around resiliency has been for some of these other standards. We've done a few things recently to begin the thinking process. We did a study just within the last year through our research foundation on sort of mapping the concepts of resiliency to our codes and standards. Where do they intersect? What provisions could address these issues better? And developed a guidance document for those who participate in the NFPA codes and standards process so that they can begin to think through this rather complicated concept and how it really will impact the documents that they're working on. And it's sort of a practical tool for them. And we brought them together to discuss, what other needs they might have, because they all come from communities and are facing some of these challenges at the local level. So we've also thought about research programs that we might undertake to kind of support better resilience provisions in our codes and standards. So we've done work on, a fair bit of work on wildland fire. We've been working with NIST a little bit in that area, trying to understand how changing wildland fire events impact ignition of communities and better design for communities. Also looking at the environmental impacts of fire and these larger fire events, what kind of impact are they themselves going to have on climate change? So kind of this whole circle of climate change, building codes, and so on. I guess the third thing I just wanted to emphasize is we've heard our previous panel, the focus on local communities, and I think that's really where all of us, work to see that the best science that's embodied in our building codes is adopted at the local level and used at the local level, and what we can do to help that happen, provide awareness, provide training, provide resources, so that the best that we can offer from our codes and standards is actually being used at the local level. So I guess those are the points I wanted to cover.
Very good. Thanks, Kathleen. She and I are colleagues from a few years ago. So Jim Rossberg, I'm with the American Society of Civil Engineers, and as many of you know, ASCE has predominantly two thrusts within our organization. One is on infrastructure. I'm sure many of you hear about the report card that comes out every 4 years, calling attention to the wonderful state of our infrastructure. They weren't listening. You were. And then the second, I think, somewhat large program that we have is in the codes and standards in the technical arena. And our cornerstone standard, I guess that's on, I'm just not speaking into it closely enough. Our cornerstone standard is ASCE 7, so named because it's the 7th one we produced. Engineers are very clever that way. And so what ASCE 7 does is basically sets the design targets for such hazards as wind, earthquake, tsunamis, which is the first time in the world that that's been done in ASCE 716, the new edition that's coming out, and things of that nature. Or another way of thinking of it is, we are what you are to be resilient against. Okay, so I got to thinking about the subject of the panel of how do we build resilience into the codes and standards. And one way we could do it is just arbitrarily increase all those loads by 10 or 15%, something like that. We may get a little opposition to that. The scientists tend to think they want to study it and figure things out more greater detail. Now we do that. Recognize we already do that in our codes and standards with our various classes of buildings. With wind, I think once you get to a Category 3, Category 4 building, you're adding 15%. The buildings that need to be in place after an event, fire stations, hospitals, nuclear power plants, things of that nature, that we really don't want, bad chemicals being released. So there is a precedent for doing that. We actually did it. I was reminded earlier today, one of the advantages of being on the last panel is you get to talk to a lot of people, get to hear a lot of things. And I ran into an old friend that reminded me that about 10 or 15 years ago, in one of our standards, ASCE 24, which is on flood-resistant design and construction, which we did in cooperation with FEMA. We moved the NFIP technical provisions into a consensus standard, and we built in freeboard, which is in effect, which was over and above the minimum, and in effect we built in resilience right there, right from the get-go. So there are ways, I think there are techniques, there's strategies to do it. I think the biggest challenge that we're going to face, and actually really is changing the mindset of the developers of the codes and standards, changing the mindset of the communities to move away from the life safety approach and move to a mindset of a higher performance objective, because that's what resilience is ultimately going to be about, is having a higher performance objective, building, again, my personal opinion, building above and beyond where we currently estimate, and then how do we factor that in? Because there's such a great uncertainty when you bring into what the climate's going to do in the future, bringing in that knowledge. There's so much uncertainty that we're going to just have to take a leap and bring those factors in into the codes and standards and recognize it. And ultimately, bottom line, it was wonderful to hear from the mayors earlier, that local political will to build to a higher standard and recognize that the uncertainty requires us to do that. So some thoughts to start us off.
A fit building is a resilient building. And as we heard before, when you use less energy, you use less water. When it's designed for a better indoor environmental quality, when you use robust materials that are sustainable, that building becomes more fit. And it's very important to do that because it needs to respond and to react and rebound from the events that are going to occur. But not only does it help that building, what else has happened is the utility infrastructure is also attempting to rebound. A building that's more fit takes less from that infrastructure and actually helps its neighbors, because those utilities can now go to the other buildings, to the other neighbors. From our standpoint, we've been blessed to write standards that are minimum requirements. And we've had help from the U.S. Department of Energy through Pacific Northwest National Labs, for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to make sure that those standards are cost effective for the building owners. And then to provide those building owners with guidance that goes beyond that. We've been working with NFPA as partners for years. With ICC, we're moving forward in collaboration with a number of different standards and codes, the International Green Conservation Code, Construction Code. But if we look at the diagram here, we're pretty good on the top and on the right. But as an engineer, an ASHRAE engineer, one of the things I apologize for is we move right to what's the problem? What do we need to solve? And some of the things we need to solve is after we get done with our standards and codes, the local people have to figure out how to use them, how to implement them, how to enforce them. That's the project teams. That's the local authority having jurisdiction. And then we turn this over to the building owner and the operator. How are they supposed to keep it operating? How do they make it sustainable? How do they rebound and react to an event? And the education of those three bodies from after we get done with our standards and codes is really where we can make an impact.
Great, thanks. That's definitely an excellent start. I know we talked about somehow the codes and standards community has already incorporated resilience. We touched on very slightly how we've already incorporated the impacts of climate change. Maybe folks can discuss that a little bit more. And then specifically, how do we move forward? What kind of research, what kind of science is necessary to inform the codes and standards development process to start incorporating some of those climate risks?
Well, I'll be glad to start off, in terms of some thoughts, because it got mentioned earlier today. Dick Wright was talking earlier about the, adaptation to a changing climate, and Jennifer's comments with respect to, well, the one I remember was the engineers always needing to not be wrong. Yeah, I tend to resemble that remark. Getting, the conversation, for whatever reason, there seems to have occurred a gulf between the climate scientists and the engineers. And we need to figure out how to bridge that and bridge that sooner rather than later. Because we certainly are in the development of the wind speed maps. I can't talk about the flood, and that's another big, I mean, okay, can we update the firms more than every other 50 years? Get the flood maps updated, but getting that research, getting that knowledge into the people that are developing the wind speed maps, developing the snow load maps, so they can begin taking advantage of it. We have to figure out how to have that conversation together rather than at each other.
Ryan, to add to Jim's comment, I think it's a fair characterization to say that the model codes and standards system in the United States is able to adapt. But what we're lacking, I think, right now is translation from the science to the loads, to put it in simple terms. And that's what the engineering community and the codes and standards developing community now needs. We could see that the climate is changing, but what does that do in terms of measurements? And engineers and architects and designers are all about measuring things, and the same with codes. Codes become law, and for building safety professionals, building officials, designers, architects, builders, we all need a little bit of certainty. So I think it's a funding research sort of question to help sort of take it the next mile.
I guess I'd like to take it a step further. A lot of the codes and standards cover many geographic areas. In the state of Wisconsin, we went from a cooler code, now we're in a warmer code, a warmer climate. There's nothing that keeps a local community from adopting a more stringent requirement from the standards in the codes. For example, if right now you're in a cooler climate and you want to, you can adopt a local code for a warmer climate, for a more humid climate. So there is actually infrastructure today that allows us to move forward quickly before perhaps the codes and standards change, that as your local conditions change, you can move forward before we even change the codes themselves.
I'd just like to follow up on a comment Jim made, actually, that Dick Wright made earlier this morning, is this concept of adaptability. And as we write building codes, or as our constituents write our codes and standards, as we went through this process over the last year on a guidance on how to embed resiliency, it was interesting to sort of see the wheels turning. And so what does that really mean, other than lifting the requirements, right? And trying to think through ways to develop codes and standards that will allow for flexibility, for adaptability, for provisions to elevate an aspect of resiliency that doesn't automatically say, up across the board. And I think with the creativity of the people that are involved in the developing our codes and standards, we're going to be able to come to grips with this. But even something as fundamental as that, is understanding what does a resilient code or standard mean, other than just a much more stringent one. And I think we're getting there, and that's of course what the design profession is looking for, and so on. So,
if I could expand on that a little bit more, I think what we're going to see, and what we're beginning to see already, is the evolution of our codes and standards, certainly our standards, into performance-based standards, and moving away from the traditional prescriptive standards. Because when you're sitting there with a performance-based, and you got to sit down with the owner and decide, okay, what are the objectives you're going to try to accomplish through the design? You can bring in these concepts of resilience, of sustainability, other concepts that aren't embedded in the classic life safety code. You can you always have to look for the incentives that are going to be needed. We heard of some of the incentives that are obstacles that get faced at the local level with one community, with a community that will against, will sort of market itself against one another almost on the codes. But I think a piece of it comes down to if we're building it better to begin with and using performance-based standards, bringing in innovation, a little bit of regulatory reform never hurts. We'll be able to ultimately perhaps have to spend a bit more up front, but ultimately we're going to have a lower life cycle cost. And we're going to be able to bring that as one of the possible many incentives into doing it better up front, going above the code, setting a higher performance objective that ultimately will serve the community for a much longer period of time, whether we're talking infrastructure or we're talking buildings, either one.
Great. So we only have a couple more minutes. I'm going to ask you a tough question, but if you could just kind of give me one quick answer each. We saw some great commitments and activities coming out of some of the federal agencies today around building codes. The last panel talked about the importance of action at the local level. What do you see as opportunities for federal government to assist local communities in adoption of effective building codes?
Well, Ryan, we're working with all these organizations up here and many others on something called the Current Codes Coalition. And one of the comments on my slide I didn't cover, but ICC believes resiliency starts with building codes. And so anything the federal government can do to help us to convince local and state elected officials to, at the very minimum, update today, not tomorrow or a year from now, today, update to current building codes would be a huge leap forward.
We heard a little bit of talk about incentives earlier today, and I think we've also heard some of the challenges that occur at the local level. And so, to me, it's enforcement and implementation at the local level that really makes all the difference. So if there's a role for the federal government in any way in incentivizing this, I think that's an appropriate one.
A couple, three things jump immediately to my mind. I mentioned earlier the flood maps. I've been away from the business for a while, but I'm not of the impression that these are kept current. That we've got a massive backlog of information and knowledge. Problem of putting a microphone in front of me, I'll get something wrong. I think the current maps do not incorporate science with regards to climate change, and they're stagnant. I got it right? That's a good change. So two other things that come to mind as well, based on what we do within ASC 7. We have a lot going on in the world of earthquakes. Fully funding and authorizing NEHRP, the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, and the one that got, tried to get started standing up 10 years ago, fully funding and authorizing the National Wind Hazard Reduction Program are paramount in my mind.
Is the last speaker between you and lunch. We'd like to take the educational opportunity to train all three of those local bodies together. Yeah, the best in the largest audience I ever had on training in a standard, we had the building code officials, the design teams, and the building owners all in the same room. It was overflowing. Why? One, the building code officials wanted to know, how do I enforce it? What do I enforce? The project teams wanted to know, what do the building code officials expect? And the building owners said, this is what I deserve from this building. And when you get all three together, hearing the same thing and asking and answering questions together, magic happens, and that's where things can really take place.
Great. Well, I especially want to thank our panelists and everyone for the discussion today. I think it's certainly a worthwhile topic and something that I think we're all interested in continuing to move forward. Thank you. I also want to thank Judge Hill and Amy Rosenband from the National Security Council for hosting us and bringing some attention to this very important issue. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining